Over 2 billion people drink Coca-Cola on a regular basis, not because they're thirsty, but because their brain has been wired to crave it. By the time a child turns 3 years old, they can identify the Coca-Cola logo before they can even understand proper English, before language, before literacy, before any real understanding of the world. This name was already part of the architecture of the developing brain. This is not a story about a soft drink. This is a story about influence, about a company that looked at the human mind and didn't ask, how do we make something people want, but how do we make people want something they don't need? John Pemberton was not a visionary. He was a war veteran with a morphine addiction and a kitchen full of chemicals, trying to feel better. The 1880s in America were strange times for medicine. Trust in conventional doctors had collapsed after decades of bloodletting, mercury treatments, and surgical procedures performed without anesthesia. People were done with the medical establishment, and filling that vacuum was one of the most brazen industries in American history, the patent medicine trade. Entrepreneurs, completely unregulated, could bottle almost anything, slap a label on it claiming it cured headaches, fatigue, low mood, female complaints, nervous exhaustion, whatever the market wanted, and sell it without consequence. No trials, no oversight, no accountability. Most of these products were useless. Some were genuinely dangerous. Many contained alcohol, cocaine, morphine, or combinations of all three. Business was booming. One of the era's most popular elixirs was a drink called Vin Mariani, Bordeaux wine infused with cocaine. It had celebrity endorsements from inventors, writers, and heads of state. Pope Leo XIII reportedly carried a personal flask of it and awarded the product a Vatican gold medal. Ulysses Grant drank it while writing his memoirs. The thing genuinely made people feel better, for obvious reasons. Pemberton came across it while recovering from a saber wound sustained at the Battle of Columbus, one of the final engagements of the Civil War. The injury was severe enough that his doctors had already prepared his family for the worst. They gave him morphine to ease what they expected were his final hours. And then, somehow, he didn't die. But the morphine stayed. By the time he discovered Vin Mariani years later, Pemberton was a middle-aged chemist in Atlanta with a serious opioid dependency and a professional obsession with finding something, anything, that might help him function without it. He was convinced the coca wine was medicinal. He started tinkering. By 1884, he had his own version on the market. He called it French wine coca. He believed in it completely. He was not running a scam. He genuinely thought he was helping people. Then, in 1885, Prohibition swept through Georgia. They banned alcohol overnight, which made Pemberton's formula worthless. He stripped the wine and replaced it with carbonated water. Without alcohol, the taste turned sharp and unpleasant. He compensated with enormous quantities of sugar. His bookkeeper, a man named Frank Robinson, suggested a new name that nodded to the drink's two remaining active ingredients: the coca leaf, which contains cocaine, and the cola nut, which contains caffeine. That later became Coca-Cola. The company would spend the next 130 years insisting the name was just a pleasant sound, a happy coincidence of alliteration. It was not a coincidence. It was also Robinson who designed the flowing Spencerian script that still appears on every can today. He understood more instinctively than Pemberton that what they were selling wasn't a beverage, it was an idea. The idea of relief, of reward, of feeling better than you did a moment ago. Pemberton never got to see what he'd created. By 1888, he was already dead, still addicted, still in pain, selling off pieces of the company in his final months to cover medication costs. He sold the full rights to Coca-Cola for $2,300. He thought he was offloading a struggling medical tonic with a branding problem. He had no idea what was about to happen. The man who eventually consolidated ownership was named Asa Candler. He's a complicated figure to characterize. Where Pemberton was a true believer, a man who thought he was healing people, Candler operated differently. He was a businessman who had grasped something that most of his contemporaries hadn't yet understood. It didn't matter what was in the bottle nearly as much as what people believed was in it. His first move was to consolidate control. He purchased outstanding shares, neutralized partners, and brought the company fully under his authority. Later investigations found that some of the ownership documents contained what appeared to be forged signatures. We'll never know for certain what happened because Candler had the early records of the company burned. The reason given was administrative tidiness. Candler's next move was a masterclass in what would later be called direct marketing. He contacted every pharmacy in the region, obtained their customer lists, and mailed a free coupon to every single name. One free drink, no purchase required. The logic was coldly practical. The drink contained caffeine, cocaine, and enormous quantities of sugar. Give someone one sample, and the chemistry would do the conversion work. But the real strategic shift was in the reframing. Advertising Coca-Cola as a medicine, a cure for headaches, a nerve tonic, was the wrong lane entirely. Medicine was for sick people. Sick people were a defined, limited market. And medicine invited scrutiny because eventually people would notice the claims weren't true. Pleasure was different. Refreshment. The simple reward of a cold drink on a hot day. That market had no ceiling, no natural skepticism, and no expiration date. So Coke quietly retired the medical language and repositioned the drink as something everyone deserved. Not treatment, not relief, a daily, small pleasure that any working person could afford. Within 4 years of Candler's ownership, Coca-Cola syrup was being sold in every state in America. He started paying celebrities, actors, athletes, and society figures to be photographed with the bottle.
With a real big thirst, who you gonna call?
He plastered the logo on barns, shop fronts, delivery carts, calendars, and clocks, and created one of the first statistical departments in American business, specifically to analyze customer movement and determine the most effective placement for advertising in stores. He pioneered the use of attractive women in advertising. The Coca-Cola girls, poised and stylish, associated the product with beauty, leisure, and desirability. He controlled the formula with near paranoid intensity. He spread deliberate misinformation about its ingredients. He filed lawsuits against imitators with a ferocity that seemed disproportionate to the product, unless you understood that what he was really protecting wasn't the formula. He was protecting the mystery. A product anyone could explain isn't a legend. A product shrouded in secrecy, with whispered ingredients and locked vaults, becomes mythology. And mythology doesn't need a reason to be loved. It simply is. Here is something that sounds unbelievable until you sit with it. In the early 1900s, two lawyers named Benjamin Thomas and Joseph Whitehead came to Candler with a proposal. Let them bottle Coca-Cola. Seal it, make it portable, sell it in stores and on street corners. Candler was dismissive. The business model worked fine. Coke sold syrup to soda fountains, which mixed it on site. Bottling was a headache he had no appetite for. But the lawyer said they would bear all the risk and costs themselves. All they needed was the rights. So he signed. For $1, he gave them the right to bottle Coca-Cola in perpetuity. No time limit, no pricing adjustment clause, no expiration, no exit provision. The most expensive single signature in American business history. When bottled Coke became successful, which it did immediately and dramatically, the problems arrived quietly, then all at once. As ingredient costs rose, the contract still locked Candler into supplying syrup at the original price, no matter what sugar costs. The bottlers had a perpetual deal, and they intended to keep it. The Coca-Cola Company would spend the next several decades and tens of millions of dollars in court trying to undo what had been signed away in an afternoon of carelessness. But here is the strange thing. The disaster accidentally made Coca-Cola unstoppable. The moment the drink became portable was the moment it became omnipresent. And the moment it became omnipresent, it stopped being a product and started being scenery, something so woven into the background of everyday life that its presence felt natural. Its absence would feel like something missing. That kind of familiarity doesn't come from quality. It doesn't come from taste. It comes from repetition at a scale that borders on the environmental. Candler had stumbled into it by accident. His successors would turn it into a science. By the 1920s, Coca-Cola had evolved beyond a product. It had become a communications operation, possibly the most ambitious ever assembled around a consumer brand. When the radio arrived, Coke was on the radio.
Coke is it, the biggest price you've ever found. Coke is it, the one that never lets you.
When television came, they were on it within months.
Good idea to keep plenty of Coke on ice all the time.
Naturally refreshing, naturally delicious.
Ice cold Coca-Cola.
When new technology emerged, Coke's response was always the same: get there first and stay there. The campaigns weren't selling refreshment, they were selling belonging, happiness, Americana. The idea that somewhere between the heat of summer and the ice in the glass, there was a moment of pure human contentment, and Coca-Cola was its vehicle. And then, when they needed a way to reach children, the most important demographic for any brand that wants a customer for life, they found a collaborator who was already universally beloved: Santa Claus. Beginning in 1931, Coca-Cola commissioned a series of Christmas advertisements featuring a specific version of Santa: warm, round, red-suited, deeply human. The illustrator Haddon Sundblom depicted him as a grandfather, someone you recognize, trust, and love. These images ran for decades and became, for hundreds of millions of children, the definitive version of Santa Claus. Children who grew up with those images didn't consciously connect Coke with Christmas. They didn't need to. The association operated below the level of language. That was the whole idea. A soft drink company had embedded itself into one of the most emotionally loaded times of the year, not through force, not through a monopoly, through the patient, persistent repetition of a single image until it became a cultural fact. Psychologists call it the mere exposure effect, the simple truth that humans develop preferences for things they've seen before, independent of any rational evaluation. You don't choose Coca-Cola because you've compared it objectively to alternatives. You choose it because it feels familiar, because familiarity feels safe, because safe feels like home. And Coca-Cola spent a century making sure it was the most familiar thing you'd ever seen. Then the war happened, and Coca-Cola did something genuinely audacious. When sugar rationing was introduced across the United States during World War II, every food manufacturer tightened operations. Companies reduced output, reformulated products, and endured the shortfall quietly. Coca-Cola's leadership looked at the rationing order and decided they should be exempt. Their argument, delivered with apparent seriousness, was that Coca-Cola was essential to the war effort, that morale depended on it, that restricting Coke was, in some meaningful sense, undermining the Allied cause. The government agreed. A Coca-Cola executive was placed on the rationing board. The company received an exemption that no other beverage manufacturer received, and Coke's president made a very public pledge. Every American soldier, anywhere in the world, would receive a bottle of Coca-Cola for 5 cents, even if the company lost money on every single one. It sounded like a sacrifice. It sounded like patriotism. Behind the scenes, the government helped fund the construction of Coca-Cola bottling plants near military bases across every theater of the war. The technicians installing those plants were classified as essential war personnel, deemed by the military to be as strategically important as the mechanics repairing tanks and aircraft. 64 Coca-Cola bottling plants were built around the world during the war years. The American taxpayer covered a significant portion of the bill. When the war ended, those plants didn't come down. Soldiers who had shared their Cokes with local populations across Europe, the Pacific, and North Africa had done something no advertising budget could have engineered. They had made the drink feel like home, like the world is worth fighting for, like a symbol of the life waiting on the other side of the war. Today, only 2 countries on Earth don't sell Coca-Cola: Cuba and North Korea. That global reach was built largely on the scaffolding of a world war. There is one part of the wartime story that doesn't appear in the commemorative editions. While Coca-Cola in America was running advertisements featuring brave soldiers and the red, white, and blue, the company's operation in Germany was doing something else entirely. Max Keith ran Coca-Cola's largest German bottling operation. As war restrictions cut off imports of Coca-Cola syrup, he didn't close the factory. He improvised. Working with local chemists, he created a new drink from industrial food waste: apple fiber, leftover whey, and whatever was available. He held a naming competition among his staff, telling them to use their fantasy. Someone shortened it: Fanta. Fanta was promoted inside Nazi Germany. The Coca-Cola logo appeared in publications alongside Nazi imagery. The product was available at Hitler Youth rallies. Some historical records suggest forced labor may have been part of the production chain, though this has never been definitively confirmed. When Allied forces arrived at the end of the war, Max Keith was not prosecuted. He was promoted. All profits from the wartime Fanta operation flowed back to Coca-Cola headquarters in Atlanta. By 1955, Fanta was being cheerfully marketed as a fruit drink across Europe and beyond. The company has never fully addressed this history. They acknowledge it when pressed, briefly, and then the conversation moves on. Fanta is still one of the best-selling soft drinks on Earth. The formula itself is a masterpiece of sensory engineering. Sugar triggers the brain's dopamine reward pathway, the same neurological highway activated by gambling, by cocaine. This is not a metaphor. This is measurable neurochemistry. Then the phosphoric acid cuts through the sweetness, sharp, almost aggressive, balancing the sugar hit so the drink doesn't become cloying. The carbonation adds something more uncomfortable than most people realize. Carbon dioxide dissolved in water produces carbonic acid on the tongue, a mild burning sensation that your brain learns to associate with the relief that follows. And then the caffeine arrives. Not fast enough to taste, but fast enough to begin working while you're still drinking. By the time you've finished a can, the caffeine is already in your bloodstream. The drink teaches your brain to want it again before the first one is finished. One study tracked children and found that even one extra sugary drink per day produced a 60% greater chance of becoming overweight. Children who drink sweetened beverages early don't just develop a preference for them. The preference is wired in at a structural level. Coca-Cola's internal strategy documents describe their target demographic in those terms. The stated goal was cradle to grave capture. The school contracts were part of this picture. Underfunded schools across America signed exclusive deals, receiving cash payments in exchange for placing vending machines in hallways and cafeterias, with bonus structures tied to volume in some cases. A teacher at one school suggested adding fruit juice as an alternative option. She was told the contract didn't allow it. By the 1980s, the data had been building for years. Sugary drinks and obesity. sugary drinks, and type 2 diabetes. Tooth decay in high-consumption communities was so severe that dentists were describing it in terms normally reserved for patients who had never owned a toothbrush. When the health evidence became too consistent to ignore, Coca-Cola borrowed a strategy the tobacco industry had already road-tested. Don't fight the science. Just make it messier. Fund studies that reach different conclusions. Call for more research. Keep the uncertainty alive long enough that no policy can catch up with you. In 2015, the New York Times revealed that Coca-Cola had given $1.5 million to fund an organization called the Global Energy Balance Network, a group of researchers who publicly promoted the idea that lack of exercise, not dietary sugar, was the true public health crisis. The organization dissolved within months of the exposé. The company acknowledged the funding. It expressed regret about the lack of transparency. It was the closest Coca-Cola has ever come to a formal acknowledgement that it had been involved in shaping the public conversation around nutrition science. Meanwhile, Coca-Cola sponsored the Olympics. They paid elite athletes, placed their logo across marathons and football stadiums, signed partnership deals with sports governing bodies around the world. The visual argument was constant and required no words. This product belongs in the same world as peak human performance. On some level, everyone knew this wasn't quite right. But knowing something and feeling something are different mechanisms entirely. Coca-Cola had always understood that distinction better than almost anyone. In Mexico, one of the world's highest per capita consumers of Coca-Cola, where some indigenous communities drink more Coke than clean water, the country's president between 2000 and 2006 was a man who had previously run Coca-Cola Mexico. During his presidency, Coca-Cola received 27 separate water concessions. Critics alleged this allowed the company to extract water from regions already dealing with scarcity. One resident put it plainly, "They are not paying anything, and they are just taking our water away." Coke sales in Mexico increased by 50% during those years. In 1985, while all of this was quietly unfolding, Coca-Cola decided to change its formula. For years, a war had been running between Coke and Pepsi. Pepsi launched what they called the Pepsi Challenge, a simple blind taste test administered in shopping malls across America. 2 unmarked cups. Which do you prefer? The results were consistent. Slightly more people chose Pepsi, not by a dramatic margin, but consistently. Pepsi ran the statistics in their advertising. Coca-Cola dismissed it publicly. Privately, they ran their own tests to prove Pepsi wrong. Same result. And every year in quarterly reports, the market share numbers told the same slow story. Coke down a fraction, Pepsi up a fraction, year after year. Inside the company, the pressure was building. A brand that had defined itself as the original, the one everything else was trying to imitate, was now losing ground to the drink it had always treated as a minor irritant. It didn't feel like a market trend. It felt, to the executives watching the numbers, like an existential insult. The Coca-Cola Company convened a secret research project. Hundreds of formula variations were tested, thousands of participants. The program was given a code name. Employees working on it signed non-disclosure agreements, and the conclusion was unambiguous. The new formula outperformed both original Coke and Pepsi in blind taste tests, consistently and by a meaningful margin. On April 23, 1985, Coca-Cola's president stepped in front of cameras and announced what he called the most significant development in the company's history. The 99-year-old formula was being retired. New Coke was here. What followed had no real precedent in the history of consumer goods. Within days, thousands of complaints were arriving every day. Letters, telegrams, phone calls so relentless that Coke's customer service lines were functionally jammed for weeks. A senator from Georgia rose in Congress to call the decision a blatant example of the insensitivity of big business. A psychiatrist consulted by journalists said that callers were describing something that resembled genuine grief, not irritation, not preference, but grief, the way people grieve when something they loved is taken away. Stadiums full of people booed Coca-Cola commercials on the big screens. A group in Seattle formed something called the Old Cola Drinkers of America and claimed 60,000 members within weeks. They held rallies, they hired lawyers, they sent cases of new Coke back to Atlanta with handwritten notes. One woman told a journalist she was stockpiling original Coke in her basement. She had, at last count, over 100 cases. She described it calmly as a precaution, like someone preparing for a natural disaster. To be clear, most of the people calling to complain had not yet tasted new Coke. They were mourning a symbol. Coke held out for 79 days. Then, on July 10, 1985, they announced Coca-Cola Classic was returning. Phone lines that had been jammed with outrage were jammed with gratitude. One Coke executive described it as the closest thing to a religious experience he'd had in a corporate building. When researchers ran the blind taste tests again after Classic Coke's return, all three versions, no labels, the original formula still came in third. They had just fought, with something approaching real fury, to get back the drink they liked the taste of least. Because it was never about taste. It was about identity, about the relationship people had built with an idea and the shattering realization that the company behind that idea had never fully understood what it had created. The product's power wasn't in its flavor. It was in the web of memory that decades of marketing had quietly constructed inside hundreds of millions of human minds. You couldn't change Coca-Cola because Coca-Cola wasn't a drink anymore. It was part of who people believed they were. Coca-Cola has a vault in Atlanta. High security, theatrical lighting. They claim the secret formula sits inside it, accessible to almost no one, one of the most closely guarded trade secrets in the world. The formula is essentially on Wikipedia. The vault is a prop. A beautiful, expensive, expertly maintained prop. Its purpose is not to protect a recipe. It's to make a carbonated sugar drink feel as if it contains something that cannot be replicated, owned by anyone else, or replaced. John Pemberton thought the value was chemical. He thought if you put the right ingredients together in the right proportions, the drink would justify itself. Asa Candler understood something different. The value was in what people believed they were getting, the feeling, the association, the story. And if you could attach a strong enough story to a product, one that connected it to happiness, family, patriotism, childhood, belonging, you didn't need the best product. You needed the best story. There's a reason Coca-Cola spends billions on advertising every year, despite the fact that 94% of the world's population already recognizes the logo. You'd think that at some point the awareness campaign would be complete, that they'd won. But the advertising was never really about awareness. It was about maintenance. The feeling needs to be refreshed, reassociated, and re-experienced in new contexts for new generations. Stop advertising and the product doesn't disappear, but the feeling starts to fade. And without the feeling, it's just sugar water. Which is, of course, exactly what it always was. When Coca-Cola changed the formula in 1985, they ran every rational test available to them. They measured what they could measure. They followed the data. They were doing, by any reasonable standard, exactly what they were supposed to do. And they were catastrophically wrong. Not because the data was inaccurate. The data was accurate. People did prefer the taste of new Coke in a blind test. They just measured the wrong thing. They measured the taste of a liquid. They didn't measure what it means to reach for something that's been in every kitchen you've ever lived in. The thing your grandmother kept at the back of the fridge. The thing someone handed you at a birthday party when you were too young to read the label. The thing that somewhere between childhood and adulthood stopped being a drink and became a minor landmark of your own personal history. Unremarkable until it was gone. And then, suddenly, irreplaceable. You can't put that in a test cup. Coca-Cola is a mirror, a reflection of something about the world that produced it. A world where the most powerful story often wins, regardless of what it's attached to. Where feelings, once built, become facts. Where a brand can outlast wars, scandals, and reformulations, not because it's the best version of what it is, but because it got there first and stayed there longest. The people who built this company were not monsters. Many of them believed genuinely in what they were making. The campaigns that shaped how an entire civilization understood Christmas and summer and refreshment and happiness. There is craft in those. There is real human creativity. The creativity was real. So were the costs it left behind. The child who can recognize a logo before she can read didn't choose that. The communities in Mexico, India, and Colombia that grew up inside the infrastructure of this brand's expansion didn't set those terms. The billions of people who reach for a Coke when they're stressed or sad or celebrating or bored, they are, in some real sense, responding to associations that were built into them gradually over years, long before they were old enough to notice. And the remarkable thing, the thing worth sitting with, is that knowing this doesn't seem to change much. The cans still sell, the stock still rises, the logo still appears on the screens of billions of people, on trucks winding through villages without clean water, on advertisements reaching children in developing markets, on the sponsorships of sporting events where athletes embody the health the product quietly contradicts. Pemberton mixed the first syrup in a three-legged brass kettle in an Atlanta backyard. He was broke. He was addicted. He was looking for something to ease the pain. In that small, broken beginning, in that very human search for relief, he accidentally created the template for the most psychologically sophisticated commercial operation in human history. And Coca-Cola spent a century making sure you felt it over and over in 1,000 different contexts before you were old enough to notice it was happening. That's the formula. Not a recipe, not a locked vault, just a feeling they put inside you, quietly, when you were very young. And it's still there.